I know it's there. I've got to believe it because I see the reactions, I see the photographs, I see the critics and people who recognize it in the street.
There is a moment, near the end of a remarkable life, when the masks come off, when the cameras are gone, when the awards sit collecting dust, and when the only thing left is the truth a person has carried quietly for decades. For Audrey Hepburn, one of the most beloved and admired women the 20th century ever produced, that moment came in her final years. And what she revealed, not loudly, not dramatically, but with the quiet consistency of someone who had long since made peace with a painful truth, surprised almost everyone who heard it. Because the man she could never fully let go of was not a Hollywood leading man. He was not a famous director or a charming co-star. He was not either of the two husbands she had married and eventually divorced. He was the first man who was ever supposed to love her. And the one who left before she was old enough to understand why. To truly understand what that meant, and why it shaped every chapter of her extraordinary life, you have to go back to the beginning. Not to Rome or Hollywood or the elegant streets of Paris. You have to go back to a little girl in wartime Europe, standing at a window, waiting for someone who never came. Audrey Hepburn was born on May 4, 1929, in Brussels, Belgium. Her full name at birth was Audrey Kathleen Ruston, and her early childhood carried the appearance of privilege. Her mother, Ella van Heemstra, came from Dutch aristocracy. Her father, Joseph Ruston, was a British-Irish banker with cosmopolitan tastes and a restless, complicated personality. The family moved frequently, between England, Belgium, and the Netherlands, and Audrey grew up absorbing languages and cultures the way other children absorb playground games. By the time she was a young teenager, she spoke English, Dutch, French, Italian, and Spanish. From the outside, it looked like a charmed beginning. Inside the family, something far more troubling was taking shape. Both of her parents had developed sympathies for fascist ideology during the 1930s. Her father, in particular, became deeply absorbed in far-right politics, attending rallies and aligning himself publicly with movements that history would judge with lasting condemnation. But what marked Audrey's life most profoundly was not her father's politics. It was what he did in 1935. He simply walked out. He left Audrey, her mother, and her two half-brothers, relocated to London, and effectively vanished from his daughter's daily existence. Audrey was 6 years old. She would later describe that abandonment as the wound that never fully healed. Not the war, not the hunger, not the miscarriages, not the failed marriages, though all of those left their marks. The original injury was her father closing a door behind him while she was still small enough to believe that fathers were supposed to stay. When the Second World War broke out, Audrey's mother made the decision to send her to the Netherlands, believing it would be safer than England. It was a decision made with love and with the information available at the time. It turned out to be catastrophically wrong. In May 1940, German forces invaded the Netherlands, and the occupation that followed would last 5 brutal years. Audrey was 10 years old when the soldiers arrived. Her family adopted a Dutch surname to protect her from being identified as British. She learned to move quietly, to speak carefully, and to read the danger in a room before anyone had said a word. These were not skills a child should need, but they became second nature to her during years when survival required a kind of vigilance that most people never experience in an entire lifetime. She watched neighbors disappear. She witnessed public executions. 2 of her uncles were arrested and killed by the occupying forces. She hid in cellars when gunfire came close and went days without adequate food. In 1944, during what became known as the Hunger Winter, German forces blockaded food supplies to the Netherlands during one of the coldest winters the region had seen in decades. Audrey's family, like so many others, ate whatever they could find: tulip bulbs, grass, anything. Her health deteriorated severely. The malnutrition she suffered during those years affected her physically for the rest of her life. And yet, even during all of this, she danced. Before the war, ballet had been her deepest passion and her clearest dream. During the occupation, she channeled that love into something more urgent, performing at secret fundraisers for the Dutch resistance, in darkened rooms where the audience could not applaud because silence was the only thing keeping all of them safe. She also carried messages for the resistance, sometimes hiding documents in her shoes as she moved through streets patrolled by armed soldiers. She was a teenager doing the work of someone who had decided that courage, even when terrifying, was still preferable to complicity. When liberation finally came in 1945, a relief worker handed her a chocolate bar. She said she never forgot it. That single small act of kindness from a stranger, in the moment after years of deprivation, stayed with her for the rest of her life. It was, she believed, exactly what it looked like. Someone who had resources reaching towards someone who had none. Decades later, when she took on the role of UNICEF Goodwill Ambassador, she would describe that chocolate bar as one of the reasons she understood, in her bones, what humanitarian work was actually for. The path from wartime Netherlands to Hollywood stardom was not as improbable as it sounds, though it required years of work that rarely gets mentioned alongside the glamour. Audrey studied ballet seriously in Amsterdam and later in London, training under some of the most demanding teachers in Europe. She was told, eventually, that her body, weakened by childhood malnutrition and too tall by the strict standards of classical ballet, would never carry her to the front rank of professional dance. She accepted that verdict without self-pity and redirected her discipline toward acting. She worked steadily in small stage and film roles in London before a chance encounter with the French novelist Colette led to her being cast in the Broadway production of Gigi in 1951. That performance announced her to American audiences in a way that no one had quite anticipated. She had something the stage and screen were hungry for, a quality that was simultaneously luminous and unguarded, elegant and completely without artifice. Roman Holiday in 1953 turned her into a star. An Academy Award at 24 made her a phenomenon. And then came a succession of films: Sabrina, Funny Face, The Nun's Story, Breakfast at Tiffany's, Charade, My Fair Lady, that cemented a legacy so durable it has not dimmed in the decades since her death. But behind the film roles, behind the iconic images and the celebrated collaborations with designer Hubert de Givenchy, her personal life was navigating terrain that was far less graceful. She married Mel Ferrer in September 1954. He was an actor and director, older than her, cultured and intellectually serious. In the early years of their relationship, there was genuine partnership. He was involved in her career decisions, and she, still finding her footing in the machinery of Hollywood, welcomed his input. But what had begun as collaboration gradually hardened into something more controlling. People who were close to the couple during those years have described a dynamic in which Ferrer's opinions increasingly governed not just her professional choices but her social life, her relationships, and her public presentation. Audrey, who had spent her childhood learning to accommodate the moods of difficult circumstances, adapted. That was what she knew how to do. But the adaptation cost her something that friends could see even when she did not say it directly. More painful than the dynamics of the marriage were the losses she suffered during it. She miscarried in 1955. She miscarried again in 1959 following a serious accident on the set of The Unforgiven, when a fall from a horse broke her back and put her in hospital for weeks. Her longing for children was not a passing preference. It was one of the deepest commitments of her emotional life. Each loss landed with a weight that went beyond the physical. Her son Sean was born in 1960, and for a period things steadied. She stepped away from acting for a full year, a remarkable decision for someone at the height of her commercial value, and devoted herself to motherhood with the same completeness she brought to everything else. But the marriage continued to erode. After 14 years, it ended. She did not dwell publicly on what the marriage had cost her. That was not her temperament. But those who knew her well understood that she walked away from it carrying a specific kind of exhaustion. The exhaustion of someone who had spent years trying to hold something together that was never quite built to last. Her second marriage, to Italian psychiatrist Andrea Dotti in 1969, began in circumstances that seemed almost designed to produce hope. They met on a Mediterranean cruise. He was warm, socially gifted, relaxed in a way that felt like relief. She was ready, genuinely, to believe in something quieter and more stable. She moved to Rome. She stepped back from acting almost entirely. She had a second son, Luca, born in 1970, and tried to build the private life she had been describing to herself for years. It did not work. Dotti's repeated infidelities became an open secret in Rome, documented regularly by a press that had never really agreed to let Audrey Hepburn have a private life just because she had asked for one. She stayed longer than she perhaps should have, partly for her son and partly because she was constitutionally resistant to giving up on a commitment she had made. But the combination of sustained betrayal and the impossibility of any real peace eventually made the situation impossible. When that marriage ended too, she was more guarded than she had ever been. 2 marriages. 2 very different men. 2 very different kinds of disappointment. And underneath both of them, a pattern that people who loved her had begun to recognize. A tendency to place her trust in men who, in one way or another, were not fully available to her in the way she needed. In the late 1970s, at a charity event, she met Robert Wolders. He was a Dutch actor who had recently lost his wife, actress Hepburn, after a prolonged illness. Their first meeting was quiet. Their second meeting, which Audrey initiated by reaching out the day after they were first introduced, turned into a conversation that lasted for hours. What followed was one of the most genuinely sustaining relationships of her life. They never married formally. Audrey did not feel it was necessary. She introduced him as her companion and, in the ways that mattered to her, as her partner in every meaningful sense. What they built together at her farmhouse in Tolokienes, Switzerland, a place she called La Paisable, which means simply the peaceful one, was deliberately unhurried. They gardened. They walked. They cooked. They gave each other, after years of public life and private disappointment, the extraordinarily simple gift of genuine steadiness. Wolders traveled with her when her humanitarian work took her to some of the most difficult places on earth: Ethiopia, Somalia, Sudan, Bangladesh, El Salvador. He was present not as a manager or a handler but as someone who refused to let her face the hardest parts of that work alone. Those who observed them together consistently noted something that was hard to articulate but impossible to miss. She was at ease. Fully, simply at ease, in a way that had not always been visible in her earlier relationships. Her work with UNICEF in the final years of her life was not a celebrity endorsement or a public relations effort. It was, by every account of those who worked alongside her, a profound personal reckoning. She sat with children in refugee camps and field hospitals in conditions that directly mirrored what she had lived through in the Netherlands as a girl. She did not speak about that history to create emotional effect. She spoke about it because it was real, and because she believed that people who had survived something carried a specific obligation to use that survival in the service of others who were still inside it.